my own doctor hadn't even mentioned the Mirena coil, and I do believe a few people had started talking to me about that, and I then started doing a bit of research with that, and my own doctor was a bit like, not sure if that should be or could be an option, and again, I didn't quite understand why. I mean, the reason I needed to go on the Mirena coil was I needed just to get without these really heavy, debilitating periods, because when you are in the menopause, you can't, well, obviously your period should stop, but mine wasn't stopping, because obviously I then went on HRT, which then brings them back. And actually I don't want heavy periods, because obviously I have fibroids, so it's a bit of a complicated situation, which is why then I thought, no, I have to get without these periods, because they are debilitating. So in some ways I've gone against my sort of natural approach, but I've felt the best I've ever felt in the last 2 months. So I have to accept that this is the route. The Mirena coil hasn't been a brilliant, let's say the first 6 months with a coil, you have to accept you might get a period. So unfortunately for me, I ended up with a period for 14 weeks, not heavy, but 14 weeks of a period with this Mirena coil. That stopped in end of August, middle of September it stopped. So I haven't had a period up until actually last week. I've just got another small, as in short one going on now. So it's not been, straightforward, but I do feel like my hormones are in the right place now. I feel like I've got the right dose of estrogen. I think estrogen for me is the biggest challenge. But that's again where medicine is not geared up for individuals. And that is what the challenge is, I think. And I'm not a medic, but that's my own feeling.
What would you say to a woman who feels like she is on a similar journey to you?
Based on how I feel now, I would 100% recommend HRT and the Mirena coil. Yes, I've gone through a lot of challenges during the summer in particular to get here. But I do feel that it's, based on the last 2 months now, that's not a long time. But based on the last 2 months, how I've been feeling is better than I've ever felt. So, I that's what I recommend. It won't work for everyone. And there's also some fear about the Mirena coil, because it's actually very painful to be inserted. But I must be honest, if you've had a baby, it's fine. That's my feeling. And I had a C-section, so I had dreadful labour, but I had a C-section, and actually I think you can cope with having a Mirena coil fitted. That's my personal opinion. But not everybody's threshold is that's not for everyone. I'm going to say that for sure. And I do think, I'm not through my 6 months yet, so watch that space in some ways. I do think it's right for me now, but I could get to beyond 6 months. And if still periods are happening, then obviously there's something wrong, and I'm going to have to go back and rethink that one. But let's hope they do stop, and that's the end of that.
And so talk about the journey that you've been on, and the kind of cultural expectation for women and in their 40s and 50s. And you have an organization, Future Fe+Male, which, as we heard in the intro, is about promoting everyday equality. How do you think that applies to women who are going through this transition in life?
I think the stereotype is being eroded, as in the stereotype of women and menopause. I think which is excellent, meaning I think there's a lot more conversation out there now about menopause, and I talk about it quite often in circles that I would never have considered talking about it before, because it was like, something to shush about, a bit like periods, to be honest. I think they all go together. The more open we are about what is happening with our bodies, that are natural processes, that are part of how we all can reproduce and bring humans into the world, the better. And there's more talk to be done, there's more books to be written, there's more openness to occur. There's certainly more education, because women in their 20s and 30s, I want them to know that if you end up in early menopause, if you don't know that it's going to come, literally you think you're going mad. And there's a whole heap of women I've heard that from, including myself. You know, you go into this very strange zone of just otherness. You kind of go, well, where's me gone? Am I still here? And unfortunately for me, that lasted quite a few years because I wasn't given the education. So I think from an equality perspective, it has to be talked about. It has to be right on the agenda for a normal conversation. For instance, slightly aside, but I talked to my son about periods quite recently because I said, you've had the chat at school. How do you feel about it? Were you shown any tampon or sanitary towel? And he said, no, in real life we weren't, but we did see something on an image to have a look. And I thought, well, if he's accepted, I'll show him. So we had a brief conversation. We got all the paraphernalia out, and we were looking at what is best and what isn't. And he was like, "What do you use?" And I just think that's exactly what we have to do. It's a human thing. It's not something tucked under the carpet or whatever. And that's the same for menopause. The more discussion and the less stereotypical, oh my God, she's on a period, or oh my God, she's in the menopause, or she's a nutter, and all these derogatory terms that are used for women to describe women, they have to be ousted. And certainly with Future Female, I'm doing what I can there to talk about menopause, and I talk less about periods because I'm not in that zone anymore. But for me, it's a combination of things. It's women's health, basically.
So talk a little bit more about Future Female and the work that you've been doing through this organization.
Yeah, so that is really looking at everyday equality through this language, through everyday habitual sexism that occurs through everyday language. So this kind of idea of derogatory terms used for, female, mainly females that come from males. We rebranded recently to have the plus sign to be more inclusive to males, because when I started Future Female, I did have the vision that this is a human story. It isn't, women, telling men they must be a certain way, because that is something I think is a barrier. I think if we join up as a team and are equally responsible to look at equality, then it becomes a very different discussion, and it becomes a very different, hopefully, action-based discussion, so that men and women own it. And you don't see the word feminism in my my sort of discussion and my detail and any language we use. It doesn't mean I'm not a feminist. It just means that term is, I feel, quite barrier focused, and people get stuck in that cul-de-sac, I call it, because feminism is brilliant and it's empowering, but in order for us all to move forward, I think it's a wider discussion around equality that everyone needs to take responsibility for. And as humans, it's in our power to sort of shift. So what we also look at is education, and I'm involved with a number of schools where we just recently did a podcast last week actually at a school. So that Born Equal podcast is inclusive of all voices, but looking into the secondary school sector to bring young voices into the mix, because that's where it all starts. As in, that's where these derogatory terms occur, and that's where stereotypes occur. And that's what is most interesting to me in education is, so how can then we reframe how we speak to each other, and how can we, get the action and get the change? And that has to come from both, as I say, male and female. So last week's podcast was just with females, but I'm looking to go in and talk to a group of males as well, or female and males together. And then I'm also looking, because I teach at higher education level, so BA level, I'm looking at podcasts through that level of student, teenage up into 20s, to see what their take is on equality and everyday habitual sexism. And then obviously we've just launched a podcast earlier this year called Born Equal. And other work we're doing is potentially linking up with a number of education organisations to create a toolkit or maybe it isn't a toolkit, because the challenge is, well, are we giving people, something to use to mask the problem, or are we going to actually see the whole kind of change in action? It's a difficult one, because we want to help shift the change, but I don't want to mask it. I don't want to give people tools to cope with it. It's almost like, well, hang on, why are we coping? It's back to that same conversation again. Why are we coping? Let's try it and think about it a different way. So yeah, hopefully that gives you an insight as to what work we're doing.
Yeah, I think it's a really important organization and really important work that you're doing. If listeners take one thing away from our conversation, what would you want that one thing to be?
Don't put up and don't cope and don't think, okay, this is how it has to be. That's it, because it doesn't have to be this way.
Thank you so much for coming on to the show, Deborah. So all of the work that you've mentioned through Future Fe+Male, where can listeners find out more about it? Where can they hear the podcast?
Yes, so the Born Equal podcast is on iTunes. It is on Spotify, and Podbean is the host. If you go to our Instagram, which is at We Are Future Fe+Male, you can find all the links in there. You can also go on our website, which is www.futurefemale.com, and yes, then the links should be also on there as well.
And all these links will be in the show notes as well.
Oh,
thank you so much.
It's been brilliant. Thank you, Lenice, for inviting me on. It's been a privilege.
Thank you. Thank you to today's guest, and to you for taking the time out of your day to listen to Period Story. Music is Modern Jazz Samba by Kevin MacLeod. You can find show notes and links to things mentioned on this episode on www.periodstorypod.com. If you love this episode, then it would mean so much if you could head over to iTunes to subscribe, rate, or leave a review. Thank you, and see you next week.